Come on, baby. All right, here we go. Okay. So, yeah, if we get done in time, I can show you how to get to that site. But it is just AP-reviews or something to that effect. And it's not Tom Ritchie. Okay. It has this, it looks like, if you remember the painting, it was a Bosch painting that showed, Christ kind of marching before Pilate and had all those really kind of grotesque figures that were surrounding Christ. That's sort of like the circular icon of the channel. So if you go in there, you'll find all of the videos that we've got so far. And they will be videotaped every day. Every day that we do something in class that's sort of lecture-oriented, those will get then published to the website. And I might decide to like video one and then maybe assign the other class homework so that we can do different things through the course of the week and see if that might be like a better strategy even. All right. So we're going to go to Google Drive, if you can follow along here. We're going to go to Notes under Unit 6. We will go to Notes, Industrial Revolution Notes, and then these say AP European History Notes 740 through 53. And so it looks like this. And there is a little bit, this is more right out of the McKay reading, but then I want to look at a few things just so that you're kind of familiar with what we need to do with that. The first is just to talk about the fact that there is like a class consciousness. And if you see what that means, it is that people really start to identify them based on their economic makeup. Whatever it happens to be. If they're unskilled labor, if they're craft labor, meaning that it's sort of like skilled labor, if they're sort of lower middle class, that there seems to be a very, very clear, bright line between those things. And I think in Europe, more than the United States, that's still pretty much the case. That there is sort of like a very, very kind of aware sort of class distinction between people. And during that time period, I think you will see that those identities develop. And that's why I think it was important for some of the thinkers to come along. And when we get to the isms and start talking about socialism and Marxism and other things, that they can kind of tap into that working class identity. Okay? I think you can see that in modern day, politicians have been able to deal with a lot of identity politics and tap into like certain interest groups that identify in certain ways. Sometimes it's racial, sometimes it's gender, sometimes it's socioeconomic. But I think that those stratifications were really, really kind of refined in the early 19th century or late 18th century even. Okay, now this one is going to be, and we're going to build on this tomorrow, because tomorrow I'm literally going to give you guys a day of questions and answers. So there's either things that you come across in the reading, things you come across in the literature, things that you come across in the lectures that have either made sense or not made sense. And then you might be doing the study guide terms and you want to finish those up. Then tomorrow would be a good day to kind of bring those questions forward so that we're kind of on the same page with it. All right? So here are some names of some people that I think you should know. All right, let's just leave it at that. So the first thing is that there's an acknowledgement that the real wages and standard of living actually went down. All right, so there's this big sort of like fake news broadcast among the middle class, okay? It would be like the people that just got the tax cut and talk about, oh, well, you're so wrong about where the tax cut is going to go. It's actually going to go to the people. Well, those same arguments were being made by the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, and some of the so-called identified middle class during the Industrial Revolution that will say, look at, our city's standard of living and look at the rise in wages and all of these other things, without really recognizing that those wages should be counteracted by living conditions, health conditions, sanitary conditions, and a variety of other quality of life standards. And then the fact is that if you actually looked at the wages themselves, they had depressed initially. So people were working actually for a lot less than they would have in like pre-industrial times. That they would have been given more wages or been given more weight prior to like the factory conditions. And that doesn't even take into consideration all of those other things. So when you wash it all out, the working class is really having a hard time. If you were to take a snapshot of England, which is the forerunner of the Industrial Revolution, but then also a forerunner of all the bad that comes along with the Industrial Revolution, it's not a really good story for the majority of the people. Okay? Yes, I mean, everything that I had talked about up to this point, England's dominance and the Crystal Palace and all of these, all of the might of the workshop of the world, but it's really not a pretty picture when you are the labor force that is actually, propelling this Industrial Revolution. Okay, so here are some people that you'll want to read about. One of them is this guy named Edwin Chadwick. And you'll hear me mention his name on a variety of different levels. But he is one of the good guys. There are sometimes they call these guys humanitarians. There are some people that call them utilitarians. We'll also call them modern liberals. And this is one of the great works of modern liberalism. It's called Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Population. And it was an expose that was as big in its time as Upton Sinclair's The Jungle would have been in its time, looking at the way that food processing and packaging was going on. And the horror stories that were just related to, hey, I received meat from the meatpacking industry. Oh, I forgot to tell you that there's fertilizer and sawdust in there. But, like a certain amount is okay, as well as like rat carcasses. Like there's a certain amount that, that the Food and Drug Administration will even allow in some of their packaging. All right. But Chadwick was one of those guys that went around and said, let's take a look at what cities look like. And you're looking at a time when, like for instance, Liverpool was one of the great industrial seaports, probably the biggest one during the Industrial Revolution. But it had a population in 1750 that was roughly about 67,000 people. Anybody wager a guess at what it was by 1850?
100,000.
It's about 500,000. Okay? So you have an infrastructure. I mean, look at Orlando now and what Orlando looked like maybe 20 years ago or whatever. Maybe your parents can tell you about it. But, I mean, the expansion is massive and it's almost overnight. And the infrastructure cannot handle it. That's the point, is that as these cities industrialize, the infrastructure is really built for a town, but has now become a city. And you don't have like planning commissions and zoning ordinances and all of those things. Those regulations don't exist until they see how dramatic the impacts are of not having those regulations. So people are building houses on top of houses. They're building schools next to the factories. There's no pollution standards. Whatever, the rust or the metal that might be coming out of some of the mills is getting deposited into the river systems, that it's getting into people's drinking water, that there is no, sewer systems that are developed or, that kind of infrastructure to allow for 500,000 people's excrement from the course of the day to be able to go through some piping and get the hell out of Dodge. Instead, it ends up literally sitting in the streets. I mean, they had some, it was almost like jokes. Political cartoons in Britain that were called Punch. Punch was this big kind of, they were famous for political cartoons, but they had one that and you guys can Google it, it was called The Court for King Cholera. And cholera is an epidemic that comes from overcrowding and comes from just the mixture of tons of different diseases with the population. And it literally shows kids as if they were playing on the playground, except what they're playing on is a gigantic pile of excrement. They're playing like King of the Mountain, except that it's a mountain of
shit.
Yes. Thank you, Julia. I knew you would step up there. So that's kind of what he's talking about. This is just a quote from him, and just one piece of it. I'm trying to find the from Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Population. Let's see if I can find it. I thought it was in this book. Maybe it's not. Oh, it's in this book. That's why. Yeah, because I got one for Dickens as well. I wanted to share that. All right, so this is a quote from that Edwin Chadwick. He said, this is talking about the conditions in Leeds, which was a factory city that was located in Yorkshire, so very kind of northern portions. That's where a lot of the mining operations were done. It says, numbers of streets have been formed and houses erected without surface drainage, without sewers, or if under drainage could even be called sewers, then with such becoming choked in a few months, or even worse as if they were altogether without. The surface of these streets is considerably elevated by accumulated ashes and filth, untouched by any scavenger. They form nuclei of disease exhaled from 1,000 sources. Here and there stagnant water in channels so offensive that they have been declared to be unbearable lie under the doorways of the uncomplaining poor, and privies so laden with ash and excrementitious matter as to be unusable prevail, till the streets themselves become offensive from deposits of this description. In short, there is generally pervading in these localities a want of the common conveniences of life. This is what he describes. Okay? So it's an environmental disaster. Who's going to hate an environmental disaster? Yeah, but especially in this time period, it's a group called the Romantics. Okay? These are poets. These are people that like look around at butterflies, you know, like flying around in the sunsets, and they write long stanzas of poems about it and call it Ode to a Butterfly on the Dawning Age or some crap, right? So they are literally watching industrial pollution destroy what was good about nature, what was beautiful about nature. Okay? But then the other part that the Romantics kind of focus on is the fact that there is something to being alive. Okay? And that cannot merely be enough. You could say, well, you're alive, and that's, of course, better than the alternative. But these folks are more about the quality of life. What exists, you know, for those of you that went to the mountain this year, the dash. What exists in that dash? And for a lot of people, that dash is nothing. Okay? There's a couple of different sources here. And one sounds like it's a blame that's being cast, and it comes from this guy named Shuttleworth. All right? That is kind of looking down on the people themselves. Let me see if I can find that one. Oh, yeah, he says, he's talking about they, meaning the working class. They live precisely like brutes to gratify the appetites of their uncultivated bodies and then die. To go they have never thought, cared, or wondered whither, meaning they haven't even really given thought to what happens after death. They just sort of like exist in space. Brought up in the darkness of barbarism, they have no idea that it is possible for them to attain any higher condition. They are not even sentient enough to desire to change their situation. They eat, drink, breed, work, and die. And the richer and more intelligent classes are obliged to guard them with police. All right? This is the debate that's going on now. All right? When we talk about entitlements and we talk about social programs, there's a whole contingency of society that blames the poor for the conditions that they find themselves in. And then there's a whole contingency of people that say that the conditions that the poor are in are the reason for the barbarism. That if you were to take a decent person and put them in that environment, that they would flip in 10 to 12 years. If you were a well-to-do, studious, industrious person, and you were privy to the day-to-day existence that the majority of those people were put through, you would become like them. All right, it's a social experiment. Those that believe that the poor are to blame for their own conditions say that's absolutely false. If you put good people with good morals in a bad situation, they're still going to rise to the top. The majority of people say, no, that's not actually accurate. Okay? We start to find more people that are starting to gain some type of sympathy for the working, the living conditions. The Romantics were among those people that said you are creating a dehumanized space when you create these industrial cities. Does that make sense to everybody? Here's one from Charles Dickens. We love Charles Dickens, right? A Christmas Carol and an Ebenezer Scrooge. Nobody talks about the poor in England like Charles Dickens. Okay? But his most, probably his least known work But probably the most relevant work relative to the Industrial Revolution is a work called Hard Times. And this is what he describes, and he calls it Coke Town. Okay, not Coke Town, but Coke referring to like the ore that gets burned. House, okay, of which you might slept 6 to 7 to a bed. And there was no showers. And even if there were, nobody would be like, I don't know, motivated enough at the end of a 15 to 16 hour workday to actually want to take one. So most people just came from the factory, marched home, collapsed, fell asleep, and waited for the next day, and then had a rinse and repeat that never ended. Okay? No vacation, no, hey, we're going to hit the coast on the weekend. There was none of that. I mean, it was so bad that it made peasantry look like, damn, we should have stuck with that. That potato famine actually sounds pretty good. So anyway, that's what Dickens is talking about. The next guy on the list, and so these become sort of like activists. They're out there and they're looking at the worst excesses of the Industrial Revolution, and they're trying to do something about it. Robert Owen is the next guy that's on the list. Okay, and he's not the typical factory worker, but he was. I mean, he had this place in Scotland. It was a textile mill called New Lanark. And when he did it, he was like the factory owner that said, you know what? I want well-lit factories. I'm keeping my people to 8 to 10 hours a day. I'm going to have picnic tables outside so that they can breathe fresh air. None of the children are working. Instead, we're going to have them in a daycare that we're going to pay for. And it turns out that all of those things that he did made his business the most profitable one. So people would come and visit, other factory owners like, hey, Bobby, what are you doing? And Bobby's like, hey, I treat my people like they're human beings. They're like, but they're not. It's like, wait a second, where's the guy that's supposed to whip the children? Well, we don't have a whip and we don't have any children. The children are receiving an education. And how come is it that when you walk through the factory floor that you know the people's names? You're not supposed to know their names. Who gives a shit? They're workers. All right? But he was like, no, they tend to work harder for you if you feel like you care about them. Like, go figure. So all of the old kind of when we talk about the Karl Marx and Frederick Engels version of factory owners, while they're trying to exploit the workplace and create hazardous living conditions and stall their wages or come up with a whole bunch of rules and regulations that say if you do any of these 1,000 things, anybody do a PSD on those, the factory rules? What were some of them?
Well, for them, it was I read the one that Frederick Engels did, the working conditions in England,
Mm-hmm.
and he was just describing how the trash was on the streets, how they didn't have water, and they had to use pipes. But then
There's all of that. But then you get into the factory, and there's like 50 things that if you do any of them wrong, you lose your day's wages. Anybody read those? Okay. So the conditions were that the factory owners, this is a time when the government doesn't really have a whole lot of oversight on what's going on. Okay. Those exposés have yet to come to bear. All right. Robert Owen is one of the people that is eventually going to be one of the expose people. He's like, maybe it was in the interaction of factory owners that had visited his textile mill that said, oh yeah, we use all kinds of child labor. Yeah, we got 6-year-olds. You know why? Well, the machines get busted, and sometimes the 6-year-old's hand's the only one that's going to get in there and unclog the machine. And yeah, sometimes the little bastards will lose a limb, but you know what? They got others. You know? So he's like appalled. He's like, you're using little children. You know, the ones that, yeah, you know, what really sucks is when they're hunched over the machines for like 14, 16 hours in their growth years. And then they end up with this really, really bad scoliosis. And that really kind of sucks, you know. So Robert Owen's like, this has got to stop. And so they put together this commission in the early 1830s. Okay, it was called the Sadler Commission. And they started to get these stories. How many saw that, the Sadler Committee reports? Or any of the testimonies from the child workers? All right, what did they say? Did you read any of them?
Yes, I mean, they were talking about how they were basically forced to give plans, and they had really bad wages and conditions, and that they would be forced to go through.
And you're a kid, right? I mean, just go take a look at the lower school. Go see what a first grader looks like, and imagine them working in a loud, heavy industry for 14 hours a day. And then their little eyes, you know, their little first grade eyes, they start to close because they're tired. But you know what? They have the overseer that'll come in and hit them in the back with a stick so that they'll wake up, because we can't slow down production. Or they would have like an ice cold pool of water, like a dunk tank. And they would grab the kid and pull him upside down and dunk him in the tank, because that would wake him up. And then put him back on. But anyway, the stories became so appalling that eventually the British legislators ended up passing the first piece of legislation to deal with it, and that was called the Factory Act of 1833. So there's things that are happening. Okay, either people are at least being human beings and saying we can't do this. Right? There's another one that comes along, and I'll talk about that too, with women and the jobs that were available to women. Did we talk about any of this already? Okay, so women, because you do have a sexual division of labor, and as you get into the factories, it becomes more of like a virile thing. These are heavy industries, and only muscular men can work the machines. So there's very few jobs that are available to women. Women too were displaced from, the agrarian areas. And if they weren't rural agricultural laborers, they moved to the cities with their families looking for work, and they needed to find a wage so that they could help feed the family. And the women were then presented with a list of possibilities. Do you want to be a prostitute? No, I was kind of hoping I didn't have to do that. Would you like to be a domestic servant? I was thinking more something in the factory. And they're like, well, we don't really have anything in the factory because those are men's jobs. There is a handful of jobs that men don't want to do. And so maybe you could do one of those jobs. All right? Let me show you what one of those looks like. Where is it? Outlawed it and said women cannot have those kind of jobs, that's terrible. Then there were women that were actually upset because they're like, what are we supposed to do now? You're not giving us an alternative. You know, this is before like the dynamics change, and you know there is more like white collar oriented work that women can do. This is still heavy industry. All right. And so, yeah, there was jobs that were, I'm not saying that this is the only thing they could do. There was jobs in the textile mills. There were women that were working in the machines and working on the looms and that sort of thing. But in the mines, this is what they got. All right? Now, just imagine. There's stories that go along here. Like Manchester, which is one of the great industrial cities. And, hopefully we'll get a chance to look at a DBQ that they got on that. But they have stats that show that at one point, like around the time when Britain was like announcing itself as like the greatest thing ever, all right, that the life expectancy for an average worker in Manchester had dropped to like 19 years old. You know? That kind of says a little bit about, this could, because the population exploded. All right, the population had almost doubled in England between 1750 and 1850, but the population is dying off to such degrees in Manchester that you could say, even with all of that, this is still happening. Like the populations might have even been higher. The life expectancies are going down. So we haven't really seen a public health movement. We haven't really seen government regulations. We haven't really gotten to a lot. There is a few pieces of things that are going on, like the outlaw of child labor under a certain age, and then some of the banning of women's participation in the mines. But for the most part, it's still a pretty clean slate. People are working 12, 14-hour shifts. Their wages, and this is one of the things that Engels was talking about, just to show you how predatory capitalism was in these early stages, that they said for the average worker that works sometimes 12 to 14 hours a day, that the second hour of their production has more or less like concluded their value, meaning they've earned their keep in the first 2 hours, and then every hour that follows after that is just straight up profit for the factory owner. Okay. Now, we're not talking about like equal distribution, and eventually we're going to get to that. All right, but we were saying that those wages were so oppressive, and you had two economists that came along that were going to explain why that was a good thing, and it was based on the idea that poor people could not be trusted to stop breeding. Okay, they were blamed for overpopulation. The poor could not stop having children. So one of the guys, his name was David Ricardo, he actually had this idea called the iron law of wages that said if you don't, because there were people that were arguing to say, maybe we could pay poor people more wages for the jobs that they do, minimum wage people, right? He came along and he's like, you know what? They'll just breed themselves down until the point that wages are just above subsistence. Because if you give them more wages, rather than saving them or investing them in some IRA or something like that, they'll take the money, they'll blow it in a tavern, they'll get really drunk, they'll go home, they'll have some relationships with whomever, and then 9 months later there'll be another potential add to the labor force. And then what happens is, if the laws of supply and demand, if labor increases, then the value of that labor decreases, and therefore the wages will decrease until it gets down to subsistence. If you artificially inflate it, it'll just get down to a place where it goes back to subsistence. So you're literally paying for nothing. So they actually discouraged factory owners for giving higher wages because they said poor people can't be trusted to do good things with their money. So you had all these advocates out there, the middle class, who have kind of identified themselves as, I did it, so surely you can do it. And then you had these working class people that were getting abused, 10 ways to Sunday, and they really didn't have a component of government that was going to look out for them. Okay, this is England circa 1830s, 1840s.
What Sundays off?
I think in some cases they did.
And what would they do?
Most of them would sleep, or they would drink, or they would go out in the alleyways and fight. All right. But here's a couple of other things. This was a guy named Gustave Doré. He did etchings and things like that. He also did some drawings.
Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner.
Right. Gustave Doré did this. This is just to give you an idea of maybe what London would have looked like around the time of the Industrial Revolution. See all those large green pastures? The public parks and all that, like Hyde Park and Central Park and all of those things, that didn't happen until they recognized that this was happening. Right? There were places where the sun never shone. Why? Because there was so much pollutants that were fired up in the atmosphere, it created a perpetual cloud. So it was dark 24/7 the entire year. Imagine that, having that dense an industrial canopy that blocks out the sunlight, has densely packed slums like this, with no running sewers and no running water. And what would happen if, God forbid, it gets to 85 or 86 degrees in London that day? Of what it must have been like to try to inhale that. All right. So have I painted a decent picture of what it looks like? All right. There's another guy that came along. His name was John Martin. This was in, I think it's in the Tate Gallery in London, for those that are really into the art. They called this the Great Day of His Wrath. And it was supposed to look at Judgment Day, or the end times. But if you look at the fire, I'm sorry, let me turn this off so you can see it. If you look at the fire in the middle, and then you look at the black and the dark grays that are kind of enveloping it, that's supposed to be the burning, the coke and all of the process of trying to turn iron ore into steel, and the blast furnaces and everything else. It literally looked like towns were on fire. And then there would be just smoke and pollutants that would kind of surround it. He's like, that looks like hell. And that's what some people's cities look like at the time. Right. So anyway, is there any upside to any of this? I feel like I have effectively planted a possibility that there might have been a downside.
No.
Is there an upside?
The economy was good.
That's not what I'm looking for. We've established that the economy was good. I'm talking about, is there an upside for these poor folk? Yeah, there is. All right, and I described it at the very beginning. But let's go back to the notes here. All right, and there's some other things that are mentioned there, and I'll get to it. But the good that is going to potentially come out of this, and you can read further on here, is this thing called the early labor movement in Britain. Okay? It doesn't take long at all. And here's the reason why. We know these things to be true. We know overcrowding is happening. We know sanitation is a problem. We know living conditions are awful. We know factory conditions are oppressive. We know wages are low. We know that children are working. We know that women are harnessed to freaking coal carts. Okay? That all those things are true. Where are they happening? Cities. They are densely packed into contained spaces. All right? This is the first time that we've really seen the poor huddled together in bad conditions. We know that the peasants for years had been kind of sporadically in bad conditions. So if they raise a fuss about it, it might be easy to isolate them and then shut them up. But to take, like, we were just using that as an example, Liverpool, but you could have used Birmingham or Manchester or any of those towns that had literally, like, octupled their population in less than 100 years. That population is made up mostly of proletariat, of working class people. That if they ever started to take their discontent and organize together and recognize what their numbers were, they could do some damage. If you just had one guy, the one that you're praying, like, hey, read a book. And he read some books and said, this doesn't seem like it accords with the natural conditions of mankind, and here's why. And then started to come up with an ideology to support it. You know, and that's what's going to take place. Either A, you're going to have some good guys, like some genuinely good, like middle class people, like Robert Owen. There's a woman by the name of Flora Tristan. You'll read about her. There's a man by the name of Edwin Chadwick. I just described him. All right. There's philosophers like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham that will come along and say that, you know, just very easy things to say that it doesn't seem like we are maximizing happiness in a place where the majority of people are suffering all of the pain, right? And a small sliver of the population is enjoying all of the pleasure. That doesn't seem like that's optimal. And that maybe government needs to intervene to redress some of those imbalances. It doesn't mean you divide the cake equally among every single person, but it says that maybe two people shouldn't have 99% of the cake, right? And then the others are getting, like, I don't know, hit in the backside with staple guns. All right, that's a weird analogy, but that's what popped into my head, okay? All right, so you watch these things, combination acts. This is preventative maintenance on behalf of the haves. They were like, if these folks start to organize together into collectives, that could be dangerous. So they outlawed them. It's called the Combination Acts. And it said the Combination Acts were ignored and circumvented to the point that they were eventually overturned in the 1820s. And then things started to happen. There were strikes. There were demonstrations. There was voices that were coming out of the woodwork. There was the formation of potentially unions. One of them was called the London Working Men's Association. And eventually that became a national union, if you will, called the Chartists. All right, the Chartist is the embryo that will eventually become the Labour Party in Britain, and it was formed in the 1820s for all practical purposes. All right, Robert Owen tried to create a national trades union. He didn't succeed, but he was trying to organize different sectors of the labor force. Okay? You had other groups, Amalgamated Society of Engineers, and eventually the Chartists that I talked about. And then you did have the government responding to some of the worst of the conditions. There was going to be a 10 Hours Act that comes in the 1840s. There would be the Mines Act that comes in 1842. There would be the Factory Act of 1833 that I mentioned. All right. So they are starting to say, hey, maybe we need to take the foot off of their throats just a little bit. Okay? Because if they don't, and that's the other story that I'll tell you, is that people got liberal, like the snowflakes. They became liberal because it was a way of kind of guarding against what the alternative would be. If you didn't have snowflakes that were intervening on behalf of the poor and the downtrodden, the poor and the downtrodden would destroy the haves, and they would do it in violent clashes. The liberals are the ones that were like, okay, let's see if we can do it in a functional and democratic way. Okay? We will elect our representatives, and we will pass these laws that will make the poor happy. All right? But if those liberals didn't stand in the road, I think the working class would get it together, and they would run those rich folks down the road. But the liberals were kind of invented at a very good time. Okay? So anyway, so sources tomorrow we'll talk about. If there's anything that you guys came across in the reading that didn't make any sense, we'll deal with it. All right, and that's it for today. Can somebody hit stop? Jonah's on it.